Narrator, June 1941. The world held its breath as the largest invasion force in human history stood poised to strike. Adolf Hitler called it a rotten structure, a house of cards that would collapse with a single kick. But while his generals toasted to a victory they thought was inevitable, one man stared into the abyss of the East and saw a different reality. He saw a massive, dormant bear, not dying, but waiting in the shadows of the Siberian taiga. This is not just a story of war. It is the story of the greatest strategic delusion in history, a warning ignored, a pride that blinded, and the moment the hunters became the hunted. Welcome to Asad History. Before we dive into the heart of the frozen inferno that consumed the Third Reich, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The summer of 1941 did not merely arrive in Europe. It dawned with a deceptive, triumphant brilliance that masked the stench of impending decay. From the rugged peaks of the Pyrenees to the scarred landscapes of the Polish border, the swastika did not just fly, it dominated. It was a flag that symbolized an era of unprecedented conquest, a testament to a military machine that had seemingly perfected the art of modern slaughter. In the heart of Berlin, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic mix of euphoria and absolute, unshakable confidence. To the German High Command, the map of Europe was no longer a collection of sovereign nations, but a checklist of fallen prey. At the Wolf's Lair, a fortress of concrete and paranoia hidden deep within the ancient forests of East Prussia, the architect of this chaos, Adolf Hitler, was preparing to deliver what he believed would be his master stroke, Operation Barbarossa. This was to be the ultimate realization of Lebensraum, a racial crusade that transcended mere territorial gain. To Hitler and his inner circle of sycophants, men who had traded their professional integrity for political favor, the Soviet Union was not a superpower, but a colossal, decaying corpse waiting for an undertaker. Hitler's contempt for the East was visceral, rooted in a fanatical ideological certainty that the Slavic people were fundamentally Untermenschen subhumans, incapable of the intellectual or organizational rigor required for modern warfare. He viewed Stalin's brutal purges of the late 1930s not as a strategic tragedy for the Red Army, but as a divine gift to Germany, leaving the Soviet military leaderless, demoralized, and ripe for annihilation. "We have only to kick in the door," Hitler famously boasted, his voice echoing through the map room with the chilling resonance of a man who had confused his own propaganda with reality, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But while the halls of the Wolf's Lair rang with the cheers of blind ambition, General Gotthard Heinrici stood as a silent, brooding sentinel of reason. Heinrici was not cut from the same cloth as the flamboyant, ideologically driven officers who crowded the Führer's table. He was a master of the grim, mathematical reality of the battlefield, a man who understood that history is not written by willpower alone, but by the cold, hard laws of logistics and geography. As he sat in his dimly lit office, the facts accumulating on his desk were not just disturbing, they were a death sentence written in ink. German intelligence, blinded by the same racial prejudice that fueled Hitler's speeches, estimated Soviet strength at a mere 200 divisions. Heinrici's own meticulous analysis, drawn from the raw data of reconnaissance flights and the desperate whispers of radio intercepts, suggested a terrifyingly different truth. The number was closer to 300, with massive unidentified formations held deep in the Russian interior. Strategic ghosts that the German plan had simply chosen to ignore. Heinrici looked at the maps, but he didn't see the clean, confident arrows of the Blitzkrieg. He saw the abyss of space. He calculated the vast, soul-crushing distances of Western Russia, a landscape where the roads were little more than primitive tracks that would, with the first autumn rains, dissolve into the legendary Rasputitsa, a sea of mud that had swallowed Napoleon's Grande Armée a century earlier. He realized that the German army was planning a sprint for a race that was actually a marathon through a primeval wilderness. The standard German 37mm anti-tank gun, affectionately called the door knocker by its crews, was already proving useless against reports of new revolutionary Soviet armor, the T-34 and the KV-1. These were not the primitive imitations Hitler described. They were masterpieces of engineering, featuring sloped armor that could deflect shells like water off a duck's back. Driven by a chilling sense of professional duty, Heinrici sought an audience with Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer divisions. In a tense meeting, Heinrici laid out his forensic dissection of the looming catastrophe. He spoke of the underestimated divisions, the superior enemy tanks, and the logistical nightmare of stretching supply lines over 1,000 miles of hostile terrain. It was here that Heinrici uttered the metaphor that would define the entire campaign. "We are not hunting a deer in a managed forest, Heinz. We are foolishly poking a massive dormant bear in its own dark den. We have no concept of how immense that bear is, or how ferociously it will fight to protect its home." The silence that followed was the sound of two seasoned soldiers realizing they were about to lead 3 million men into a meat grinder fueled by one man's ego. Yet, when they finally stood, the silence of the Russian dawn on June 22, 1941, was not broken by a whisper, but by a cataclysmic roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the earth asunder. 10,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, a wall of flame and steel that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This was the opening note of Operation Barbarossa, a symphony of destruction that Hitler believed would end the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. As the first shells impacted, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft while they sat helplessly on their runways, the German Wehrmacht, the most sophisticated killing machine ever assembled, surged forward. At first, it looked exactly like the victory Hitler had promised. The panzer groups, led by men like Guderian and Hoth, sliced through the disorganized Soviet border guards with terrifying ease. The world watched in stunned silence as entire Soviet armies were surrounded in massive cauldrons at Minsk and Smolensk. To the observers in Berlin, the Soviet bear wasn't just poked. It looked as if its spine had been snapped in the very first hour. However, as General Heinrici moved his infantry divisions forward through the smoking ruins of the frontier, a chilling realization began to settle in his mind. A realization that was completely missing from the triumphant headlines in Germany. The Soviet soldier was not the subhuman coward described in Nazi propaganda. Even when surrounded, even when their officers were dead and their ammunition was gone, the Red Army soldiers fought with a suicidal, primeval ferocity that shocked the veteran German troops. They did not surrender. They retreated into the forests, forming partisan groups that would haunt the German supply lines for years to come. The rotten structure was not collapsing. It was bleeding, and in its blood, it was finding a new, terrible strength. As the German advance pushed deeper into the vastness of the East, the abyss of space that Heinrici had feared began to swallow the German supply lines. The dust of the Russian summer, fine as flour, choked the engines of the panzers and the lungs of the soldiers. But the dust was merely a precursor to a much greater enemy. By late September, the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray, and the legendary Rasputitsa, the season of mud, arrived with a vengeance. Within 48 hours, the primitive Soviet road network simply ceased to exist. It transformed into a bottomless, glutinous quagmire of thick black sludge that could swallow a horse whole and trap a 30-ton tank to its hull. The German Blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed and mobility, ground to a humiliating, agonizing halt. Thousands of trucks carrying vital fuel, food, and, most crucially, winter clothing, were abandoned in the mire. The German soldier, still dressed in his thin summer tunic, found himself standing in a freezing swamp, miles from the nearest supply depot, staring into an endless horizon that seemed to offer nothing but death. In the midst of this logistical nightmare, the T-34 Terror finally hit the German front lines with the force of a thunderbolt. German anti-tank crews watched in paralyzed horror as their shells bounced harmlessly off the revolutionary armor of these Soviet monsters. The myth of German technological superiority was shattered in a single afternoon. Guderian's panzers were being outgunned and outmaneuvered in the very terrain they were supposed to dominate. And yet, the orders from the Wolf's Lair remained unchanged. Forward at all costs. Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic capture of territory, began to interfere in every tactical decision, diverting forces away from the primary objective of Moscow to engage in meaningless battles for prestige. The German army was now a giant whose limbs were being stretched to the breaking point, its muscles tearing under the weight of its own ambition. They were no longer the hunters. They were trapped in the bear's den, and the temperature was starting to drop. The first frost was not just a change in weather, it was the arrival of the Soviet Union's greatest general, winter, and the German army, shivering and starving, was about to face a fury that no military manual could have ever prepared them for. As November 1941 bled into December, the Russian landscape transformed from a muddy trap into a crystalline, white hell. The temperature did not just drop, it plummeted, reaching levels that defied human comprehension, -30, -40, and eventually -50 degrees Celsius. For the German soldier, the dream of a swift victory had evaporated, replaced by the primitive raw struggle for survival. They were now at the gates of Moscow, so close that some officers claimed they could see the golden spires of the Kremlin through their frost-covered field glasses. But those spires were a mirage, a cruel taunt from a city that refused to die. The German Wehrmacht, once a prideful juggernaut of steel and fire, was now a ghost of its former self. Men were shivering in summer uniforms that had turned into rags, their leather boots designed for a European parade ground, becoming frozen traps that turned feet into blackened, gangrenous wood. This was the moment of the great miscalculation. While Hitler, from the warmth of his bunker, ranted about the biological inferiority of the East, the Red Army was preparing a counterblow that would shake the foundations of the Third Reich. General Zhukov, a man of iron will who mirrored the coldness of the Russian winter, had quietly moved hundreds of thousands of fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions from the Far East. These were not the broken, demoralized troops the Germans had faced in the summer. These were men born of the frost, equipped with white camouflage, quilted jackets, and the legendary PPSH-41 submachine guns. On December 5th, as the German oil froze in the engines of their tanks and the firing pins of their rifles snapped like glass in the cold, the Siberian storm broke. The bear had not just woken, it had lunged with a primal, vengeful fury that turned the snow red. For the soldiers of Asad History. This part of the chronicle is a grim reminder of what happens when ideology blinds strategy as the Soviet counteroffensive surged forward. The German lines, stretched thin and brittle like frozen wire, simply shattered. For the first time in the war, the invincible German army was in full chaotic retreat. Hitler, in a fit of megalomaniacal rage, issued his famous halt order, forbidding any retreat and condemning his men to stand and die in their shallow, frozen foxholes. It was a death sentence thousands of young Germans, who months earlier had marched toward Moscow with songs of victory, were now being consumed by the land itself. They weren't just dying from bullets, they were being hollowed out by hunger typhus, and a cold so absolute that it seemed to freeze the very soul. The bear's den had become a massive open-air graveyard, and as the German generals looked at their maps, They realized with a sickening horror that the war was no longer about conquest, it was about whether the German nation would survive the winter it had so arrogantly provoked. Asad History note is paragraph co. Main the failure at the gates of Moscow was not merely a military defeat. It was the shattering of a dark, delusional dream. As 1941 turned into the long, bloody years that followed, the shadow of Operation Barbarossa grew to encompass the entire German nation. The great kick that Hitler had promised would bring the Soviet Union down had instead triggered an avalanche that would eventually bury Berlin itself. The warnings of General Heinrici, once dismissed as the whispers of a coward, now rang through the hollowed-out corridors of the Reich like a funeral knell. The German army would continue to fight with a grim professional desperation for 3 more years, but the soul of the Wehrmacht had been left behind in the frozen wastes of the East. The bear was no longer dormant. It was a relentless, unstoppable force of vengeance, fueled by the very atrocities the German invaders had committed in their arrogance. From the ruins of Stalingrad to the final desperate defense of the Silo Heights, the momentum of history had shifted irrevocably. The hunters had become the pathetic prey fleeing across a continent they had once thought they owned. This is the ultimate legacy of the invasion of the Soviet Union, a testament to the catastrophic price of hubris. When leadership replaces objective reality with ideological fantasy, the result is always ruin. The 3 million men who marched east were sacrificed on the altar of a madman's ego, their lives discarded like ash in the wind. The vast, silent forests of Russia and Ukraine remain today as a massive unmarked cemetery, a haunting reminder of the abyss of space and time that consumes those who refuse to learn from the past. The ghost of 1812 was not a myth. It was a prophecy that Hitler chose to ignore at the cost of his empire and his life. As the Soviet flag was finally raised over the smoke-blackened ruins of the Reichstag in May 1945, the roar of the bear finally subsided, leaving behind a world forever changed. History is a mirror, reflecting our greatest triumphs and our most devastating failures. At Asad History, we believe that by understanding the shadows of the past, we can find the light for our future. If this journey into the heart of the 1941 invasion moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Asad History. Share this story with those who seek the truth behind the